Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are really immersing ourselves in what might be the most, well, sophisticated and intricate diplomatic tightrope walk happening right now.
hmm
We're talking about Vietnam's delicate, complex, and frankly, highly consequential navigation between the ambitions of the United States and, the sheer gravity of China.
It's a fascinating case study.
It really is, and it's a strategy so layered that it's actually earned its own name, a very evocative phrase, bamboo diplomacy.
It truly is a masterclass, I think, in modern geopolitical hedging. For you, the listener, getting your head around this is kind of a shortcut to understanding how smaller nations can actually maximize their leverage in this increasingly polarized world we're in.
Yeah, polarization is the word.
Right. And Vietnam's task is just monumental. They have to simultaneously maintain absolute political stability, which is no small feat in itself, protect their genuine national independence, and sustain their really, really impressive economic growth trajectory.
And you have to do all that while being stuck, basically.
Pretty much. Situated physically, historically, and often ideologically, right in the crosshairs of these two massive competing powers. It's quite the position to be in.
And that name, bamboo diplomacy, it's not just catchy, is it? It feels like it really captures their whole approach. It's almost a blueprint.
It really is. You think about the plant itself, bamboo, and the metaphor just clicks.
How so?
Well, bamboo is known for its physical properties, right?
Yeah.
It's incredibly flexible. It can bend dramatically with the strongest wind, almost flat sometimes.
Okay, so that's the strategic flexibility bit.
Exactly. That's the surface layer bending when you absolutely have to avoid being snapped by great power pressure. But crucially, bamboo is also known for being incredibly strong, deeply rooted, very dense.
Right, strong roots.
That represents the unshakable core, the commitment to their national interests,
Yeah.
sovereignty, territorial integrity, political unity. Those things don't bend.
So bending, not breaking, that's the mantra. And the ultimate goal is, what, strategic autonomy?
Strategic autonomy, absolutely. They refuse, point blank, to be locked into one side's exclusive camp. They have to always keep their options open. And they're adamant that Vietnam, not Washington or Beijing, controls its own destiny, its own path forward.
That makes perfect sense conceptually. But okay, how do they actually do it? How do you operationalize that kind of ambiguity day to day?
That's really the mission for our deep dive today, isn't it?
Yeah.
We need to unpack this strategy by looking at the specific tactical mechanisms they use.
Okay.
And this means focusing particularly on the highly complex and often, let's be honest, seemingly contradictory security and military relationships they maintain. We're talking Russia, China, even North Korea.
While getting closer to the U.S. at the same time.
Precisely. While simultaneously deepening their engagement with the U.S., it's this incredibly dynamic balancing act where, every single move seems calculated to maintain that equilibrium.
Right. So to really understand how they manage this extraordinary tightrope walk, we probably need to look at their sort of core operating manual, right? Their guiding principles.
We know Vietnam's foreign policy is driven by these three vital, relentless interests: political unity, independence, and economic development. We mentioned those. But these are operationalized through their foundational hedging strategy, the famous Four No's policy.
Ah, yes, the four no's. This is the formal, publicly stated framework. It basically sets the non-negotiable boundaries of their strategic autonomy. It's how they signal to the world, and you can bet, particularly to the superpowers, where the lines are drawn.
Okay, so what are they?
Well, the first two are pretty classic tenets of non-alignment, stuff you'd expect. First, no military alliances. Simple enough.
No formal treaties like NATO or anything like that.
Exactly. And second, no foreign military bases on Vietnamese territory.
Okay. Clear boundaries, designed, I suppose, to prevent them from becoming just a pawn in someone else's great power chess game.
That's the idea. Keep foreign military entanglement at arm's length.
And the third no, you mentioned it was formalized more recently in their 2019 white paper on national defense. That's right. That one focuses entirely on conflict avoidance. It's pretty straightforward. No using force or the threat of force in international relations.
So projecting a peaceful stance.
Exactly. It sets an essential diplomatic tone, projecting peaceful intentions globally. But, if that was the end of the policy, it would just be too rigid. It wouldn't allow for the bamboo part.
Right. Not much bending there.
The genius, maybe, or at least the ultimate expression of the flexibility inherent in bamboo diplomacy, comes from this critical caveat, this little asterisk attached to the whole policy.
Okay. The loophole, the slight crack in the door that allows the whole balancing act to actually work.
Precisely that. The official policy documents state, and this is the key phrase, that Vietnam may consider increasing defense cooperation with other countries, depending on circumstances and specific conditions.
Depending on circumstances and specific conditions. Vague enough.
You really need to understand this phrasing, because this is where all the action is. This caveat is the mechanism that allows them to maintain, say, a top-tier security partnership with Washington,
Which we'll get into.
and simultaneously rely on Russian arms for their military needs, and even conduct military exercises with China. It means they reserve the sovereign right to interpret circumstances and specific conditions however they see fit, as long as it serves those three core national interests we talked about.
Okay, so the policy looks pretty hard line and neutral on paper, but in practice, that tiny little asterisk gives them all the wiggle room they need, the fluidity to pivot based on necessity.
That's it exactly. If, let's say, Chinese coercion in the South China Sea ramps up well, that constitutes a specific condition, doesn't it? And that justifies closer maritime security cooperation with the U.S.
Right.
Or if they need advanced fighter jets or submarines that maybe the U.S. isn't willing or able to sell them, that's a circumstance that justifies maintaining those deep, long-standing defense ties with Russia.
Got it. So it's a policy designed for maximum ambiguity, tactical maneuverability.
That's the name of the game.
And the need for this really careful balancing, especially the caution about being dominated by a neighbor, it's just profoundly rooted in their history, isn't it? I mean, Western analysis often frames Vietnam's history around the war with the United States. That couple of decades.
Yeah, the American War, as they call it.
But for Vietnam, the history, the conflict with China, it's on a completely different timescale.
Oh, it's measured in, well, almost geological time compared to the U.S. conflict. Look, the war with the U.S., deeply scarring, absolutely, lasted about 2 decades in the mid-20th century. But Vietnam experienced over 1,000 years of Chinese domination, a millennium, which finally ended way back in 1938 A.D.
1,000 years. Wow.
That level of prolonged subjugation, it just creates an entirely different psychological and political lens through which they view their dominant northern neighbor. It's baked in.
So that suggests that this mistrust isn't just some ancient memory they dust off occasionally. It's more like an institutionalized feature of their statecraft.
It is absolutely woven into the fabric of the state. And look, the tensions aren't just ancient history. They fought a pretty brutal border war with China as recently as 1979. That was shortly after they unified the country.
Right after the American War ended.
Exactly. And today, the primary security threat, the main source of current friction, it's Beijing's assertive behavior. Along the land borders, yes, but most critically in the South China Sea. Those maritime disputes are constant.
So when Vietnamese leaders, or even their public, think about foreign alignment, this deep-seated caution, this mistrust, it's fundamentally directed north towards China.
Overwhelmingly.
Which means siding with the U.S. or even just, leaning that way, strengthening ties. It isn't really about embracing Western democratic values or anything like that.
Not primarily, no.
It's fundamentally about securing a powerful strategic hedge. Insurance, maybe, against potential domination by this historically powerful and currently assertive neighbor. It's just ultimate pragmatism, survival strategy 101.
That's certainly the consensus view from analysts watching the region closely. For Hanoi, national interest, which means survival and sovereignty, always trumps shared ideology. You can see it time and again.
And we can actually see this historical caution, this threat perception driving real regional polarization today, can't we? There's some pretty stark data from early 2025 that really paints this picture.
Yeah, there was a really insightful survey conducted by the Aziz Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, highly respected outfit.
What did they ask?
They asked ASEAN thought leaders, academics, policymakers, business leaders, journalists across Southeast Asia, a really tough hypothetical question. If ASEAN were truly forced to choose a side between the U.S. or China, which one should it align with?
Ooh, putting them on the spot.
Definitely. And the results showed this really clear split within Southeast Asia, almost geographic, but also thematic.
Okay, so how did it break down? Who's in which camp?
Well, you see this overwhelmingly pro-China camp, and it seems to be driven almost entirely by economic gravity. Pure economics. Take Indonesia, for example. Huge country, massive economy. They showed a remarkable 72% preference for aligning with China if forced.
Wow, nearly 3/4.
Yeah. And Malaysia was very similar, 71% leaning towards China. Why? Because their economies are just fundamentally intertwined with China's. deep trade relationships, heavy reliance on Chinese investment, huge participation in things like the Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure project.
So for them, it's just an economic necessity almost. Siding with Beijing makes economic sense.
That seems to be the calculation, yeah. But then you look at China's immediate regional neighbors, specifically Vietnam and the Philippines, and they're firmly resisting that economic pull. They lean heavily towards the U.S. instead.
Heavily.
Vietnam favored the U.S. by 74%, and the Philippines even more dramatically by a staggering 86%.
86%, that's huge. So what's driving them in the opposite direction if it's not economics?
It's security, pure and simple. For these two nations, Vietnam and the Philippines, the perceived existential threats posed by territorial disputes, by sovereignty concerns relating to China's increasing assertiveness in the South China Sea, that takes absolute precedence over economic alignment.
They feel the pressure much more directly.
They're on the front line, essentially. They specifically seek the U.S. as a security partner, as a powerful counterweight, because they feel directly threatened by Beijing's actions right on their doorsteps, in waters they consider their own.
Okay, so whether it's driven by 1,000 years of historical caution or very immediate present-day maritime security concerns, Vietnam's strategic tilt the bend in the bamboo, if you like, is fundamentally dictated by the perceived threat from its giant northern neighbor.
That seems clear.
But, as you pointed out earlier, they can't afford to break with Beijing entirely either. They need that balance. And that brings us neatly, I think, to the foundation of their diplomatic strength, which allows them to even attempt this balancing act.
Exactly. That's strategic autonomy we've been talking about, this ability to hedge, to push back against great powers. It's not just an abstract idea floating in the ether. It needs to be funded. It requires real national strength, real leverage.
Money talks, even in geopolitics.
It certainly helps. And that brings us squarely to Vietnam's deep economic aspirations. These aspirations, and their success in achieving them so far, form the absolutely indispensable bedrock of their diplomatic leverage in the 21st century.
And the starting point for that modern economic story is the Doi Moi reforms, right? We have to mention those. That was Vietnam's equivalent, sort of China's reform and opening up. Began back in 1986.
That's the watershed moment.
Yeah.
Doi Moi meaning renovation. This is the big ideological and structural shift away from a centrally planned economy towards what they officially term a socialist-oriented market economy.
Which sounds a bit contradictory, but it seems to have worked for them.
Well, those reforms certainly created the conditions for the truly remarkable and pretty consistent economic growth Vietnam has sustained for decades now.
Yeah.
You often see them hitting 6%, sometimes 7% GDP growth annually, year after year.
That's impressive, sustained growth.
It really is. And this economic success, this engine, is what gives their diplomats the credibility, the confidence, and frankly, the freedom to sometimes say no, or we need more time, or even we're going to cooperate with your rival when talking to the superpowers.
It gives them options.
Exactly. Their ultimate goal, which is incredibly ambitious, is enormous. They aim to become a high-income country by 2045. That's the big target. And achieving that economic success is completely inseparable from maintaining their diplomatic independence. The two go hand in hand.
And interestingly, the intense U.S.-China rivalry, which you'd think might squeeze a country like Vietnam, has actually, maybe paradoxically, been a massive economic gift for them recently. It's accelerated their growth through this thing analysts call the China plus one phenomenon.
Oh, it's been a huge windfall. Something few people really predicted the scale of, maybe back in the early 2010s. What happened was global companies started realizing the risks, the existential risks sometimes, of concentrating almost all their manufacturing in China.
Putting all their eggs in one basket.
Precisely. Whether it was because of rising labor costs in China or the political uncertainty from the U.S.-China trade tensions, or maybe the supply chain vulnerabilities that things like the COVID pandemic just starkly exposed, they realized they had to seek alternatives, diversify.
And Vietnam was ready.
Vietnam stepped up and offered a really unique package, a stable one-party government, which companies like for predictability, consistent high GDP growth, a very favorable demographic profile, something like 2/3 of the population is of working age, and critically, this huge cost advantage.
I remember seeing those figures comparing labor costs, but the scale of the difference is still pretty striking. Just how stark is that cost advantage for a big global manufacturer looking to set up shop?
The difference is, well, it's almost unbelievable when you think about a major manufacturing hub. The average hourly minimum wage in Vietnam is roughly 77 US 60 hours. It fluctuates a bit by region, but that's the ballpark.
Okay, under $1 an hour.
Now compare that to China. The minimum wage there, especially in the coastal manufacturing zones where most foreign companies operate, is closer to $3.60 an hour, and often quite a bit higher depending on the city and industry.
Wow. So that's nearly a 4-to-1 difference.
Roughly, yeah.
Yep.
A nearly 4-to-1 difference in basic labor costs. Now think about massive industries that are heavily reliant on manual labor, textiles, footwear, electronics assembly. For them, that difference translates directly into billions, potentially, in savings. It's a game changer.
And that explains why you see these huge multinational giants rushing in. We're talking about companies like Samsung, right? They've invested billions in huge assembly hubs there.
Massive investments.
Yeah.
And Nike, too. Nike now sources something like nearly half of all its footwear from factories in Vietnam.
Half. That's incredible.
This isn't just small-scale niche production anymore. This is manufacturing at a scale that is fundamentally changing the global supply chain map. Vietnam's become a core node.
Okay, so manufacturing is huge. But beyond that, Vietnam holds another really big strategic card, doesn't it? Something literally underneath the ground that's absolutely crucial for this 21st century tech competition. We're talking rare earth elements.
Yes, this is a major source of leverage, potentially, in the global tech race and the defense competition. It's a huge deal.
So what kind of reserves are we actually talking about? How significant is it globally?
We're talking about Vietnam holding what current geological surveys estimate to be the world's second largest known reserves of rare earth elements, second only to China.
Second largest? Wow, what percentage is that?
The estimates put it at roughly 19% of the known global total. China, for comparison, holds about 37%. So Vietnam's share is really significant.
And these rare earths, just remind us, why are they so critical?
Well, these 17 elements, they're basically indispensable for almost all advanced modern technology. Think high-efficiency magnets that go into smartphones and wind turbines, electric vehicle batteries, precision-guided missiles, advanced radar systems, fighter jets, the whole 9 yards. They are, you could say, the essential vitamins of the modern military-industrial complex.
Okay, so as Washington, and probably Europe and Japan too, are actively trying to de-risk their critical mineral supply chains, trying to build non-Chinese alternatives, Hanoi suddenly finds itself holding some extremely valuable cards.
Extremely valuable. This means Vietnam isn't just an economic opportunity for the West, a place to make things cheaper. It's potentially a strategic necessity.
That changes the dynamic quite a bit.
Absolutely. This rare earth leverage forces both superpowers, the U.S. and China, to engage with Hanoi respectfully. They have to offer concessions. Vietnam is potentially indispensable to the U.S. as a non-Chinese supplier, particularly for critical defense technology components.
In China's perspective.
Well, simultaneously, China wants to make sure that Vietnam doesn't exclusively align those crucial resources with the West or cut China out of the picture. So this resource wealth, it actually enhances the whole idea of bamboo diplomacy. It ensures both great powers have a strong incentive to keep courting Vietnam, which in turn strengthens Hanoi's strategic room to maneuver. They can play one off against the other.
That sounds like a pretty perfect position to be in, leveraging that competition. But this economic tightrope walk, it's not without some serious friction, is it? Particularly, and maybe ironically, coming from the U.S. side.
Yeah, there's a deep irony here.
On the one hand, the U.S. clearly wants Vietnam to succeed as a strategic alternative to China, economically and politically. But on the other hand, Washington has also imposed some pretty significant tariffs on certain Vietnamese exports.
This is where the political paradox really bites, isn't it? And it highlights how domestic politics, particularly trade politics in the U.S., can sometimes undermine broader strategic foreign policy goals. The U.S. has, at times, slapped reciprocal tariffs, sometimes as high as 46%, on specific Vietnamese goods, things like textiles, footwear, some electronics.
46%, that's huge. Why? What's the justification?
It often stems from complex U.S. domestic trade politics. There might be accusations of currency manipulation by Vietnam or concerns about illegal transshipment, basically, Chinese goods being slightly modified in Vietnam and then exported to the U.S. to avoid tariffs on Chinese goods. It gets very messy.
But the impact on Vietnam's economic stability, the very foundation, as you said, of their diplomacy must be quite severe, right? Those kinds of tariffs.
It's highly disruptive. It creates immense uncertainty, not just for Vietnamese companies, but also for the foreign investors who are considering shifting production from China to Vietnam. Why move if you might get hit with huge tariffs anyway?
Makes sense.
Analysts have estimated that these tariffs, combined with the general unpredictability they create, threaten to reduce Vietnam's potential GDP growth, by pretty significant margins, somewhere in the range of 1.4% to 2.0%.
Wow, that's a big chunk off their growth rate.
It's not trivial at all for a rapidly growing economy that's counting on that growth. It puts their big 2045 high-income goal potentially at risk if it persists.
So Hanoi finds itself in this almost impossible bind. They need U.S. technology, they need U.S. capital, they arguably need the security umbrella the U.S. provides, especially regarding the South China Sea disputes. But at the same time, they absolutely cannot afford to fundamentally antagonize Beijing. China provides essential stability on their massive land border, critical infrastructure investment. It's a huge market, too. They need constructive, stable relations with both, even if one is their primary historical antagonist and current security concern.
And that delicate, demanding necessity drives their security policy. It forces them onto that military tightrope.
Right. That need for simultaneous, careful engagement with competing superpowers leads us straight into their defense strategy. And this is where you really see bamboo diplomacy and the flexibility of that four-nose policy in tangible action. Let's start with the relationship that signaled the most recent significant tilt towards the West, the big U.S. upgrade.
Okay. So in September 2023, the relationship between Vietnam and the U.S. was officially upgraded to a comprehensive strategic partnership, a CSP.
And that's their highest level.
That is Vietnam's highest possible diplomatic tier. It's a designation they share with only a handful of other countries, notably, including China and Russia themselves, which tells you something about the balancing act right there.
Interesting. So what does this CSP signal?
Well, on the surface, it signals a deep intention for cooperation across the board, high-tech exchange, trade, investment, and crucially, maritime security. It absolutely looks like a major step westward. An implicit alignment, certainly against Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea. That's how it's widely interpreted.
But what does that highest diplomatic tier actually translate to on the ground, especially regarding security? Because as we discuss, they're still sticking to the four-nose. No formal military alliance, no foreign bases allowed.
And that's the subtlety, the nuance. The CSP allows for things like significantly enhanced Coast Guard assistance, providing patrol boats, training, intelligence sharing. It allows for more joint military training exercises, though typically focused on things like humanitarian disaster relief, search and rescue, maritime law enforcement, not offensive warfighting.
So non-lethal focus.
Mostly. It allows for the transfer of some non-lethal defense technology, and it allows for more frequent U.S. Navy port visits to Vietnamese ports, which are highly symbolic displays of freedom of navigation and offer visible support for Hanoi.
But it stops short of.
But it stops well short of providing the kind of advanced, offensive military hardware Vietnam might want for deterrence, or any kind of formal NATO-style treaty obligations where the U.S. would be bound to defend Vietnam.
Yeah.
So the U.S. becomes a top-tier partner, a key security facilitator, absolutely, but not a formal ally in the treaty sense.
Okay, so a very close partner, but still maintaining that line based on the four-nose.
Exactly.
But the picture gets significantly cloudier, doesn't it? And much more complex when you look at where Vietnam actually sources the heavy-duty weapons it needs for its full defense modernization program. That no military alliances rule lets them shop around, apparently.
It does. And their primary supplier is decidedly not the U.S.
Who is it?
That primary supplier remains Russia. This is a relationship forged way back in the Cold War, built on ideological alignment then, that has now evolved into a kind of mutually beneficial arms dependency. Historically, and right up to the present day, Russia is Vietnam's single largest arms supplier.
And what kind of kit are we talking about?
We're talking crucial advanced military hardware. Everything from their frontline Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets to their Kilo-class submarines, which form the core of their undersea deterrent, sophisticated air defense systems like the S-300 or S-400. Basically, the high-end stuff needed for credible national defense.
Okay, but why Russia specifically? In the post-Cold War world, why not look to other major defense suppliers? Maybe European countries? France? Or even India, perhaps?
Well, there are a couple of main reasons, really. First is just historical compatibility and path dependency. Vietnam's military infrastructure, its training doctrines, its maintenance crews, they're all fundamentally based on Soviet-era systems. Russian equipment integrates much more seamlessly without requiring massive, incredibly costly overhauls of their entire military structure.
Okay, inertia plays a role. What's the second reason?
The second reason is the type of equipment. Russia has historically been willing to sell Vietnam the specific kinds of offensive and high-tech systems like advanced anti-ship missiles, those quiet kilo submarines, long-range strike aircraft, that Vietnam feels it needs to credibly deter a much larger potential adversary like China, especially in the maritime domain.
And the U.S. wouldn't sell them those.
It's highly unlikely. Either the U.S. nor most European allies would typically be willing to sell those kinds of advanced, potentially destabilizing offensive systems to a developing country with a communist government, especially one bordering China. Russia fills that gap.
Got it. And this Russian military connection, it's not just about arms sales, is it? It involves other things too, like strategic access and even energy cooperation that directly challenges China's claims in the South China Sea.
Absolutely. It goes deeper. Russia has enjoyed preferential access, not a formal base adhering to the Four No's, but preferential access for resupply and maintenance to the strategically crucial Cam Ranh Bay naval facility since around 2014. That's a huge symbolic gesture of the depth of the partnership.
Cam Ranh Bay is a big deal historically and strategically.
Huge. Furthermore, their cooperation extends right into the most sensitive geopolitical flashpoint in the region: energy extraction in disputed waters. Russian state-owned oil companies like Rosneft actively collaborate with PetroVietnam, the Vietnamese state oil company, to explore and extract oil and gas resources within China's aggressively claimed Nine-Dash Line in the South China Sea.
Wow. That must really annoy Beijing.
It leads to constant friction. You regularly see reports of Chinese Coast Guard ships complaining, shadowing the Russian-Vietnamese drilling rigs and survey ships, attempting coercion. But the operations continue, backed by this Russo-Vietnamese cooperation.
So Vietnam maintains this deep, multifaceted tie with Moscow because, one, it's essential for their immediate defense posture, getting the weapons they need.
Right.
And two, it serves that deeper strategic goal of diversifying their security dependencies. It stops them from becoming solely reliant on U.S. influence or goodwill.
Exactly. It diversifies their risk portfolio, you could say. And it enhances their actual deterrence capabilities against potential threats. Crucially, it allows them to maintain that essential strategic distance from both Beijing and Washington, keeping them consistent, at least in spirit, with the Four No's.
Okay, so we have this top-tier comprehensive strategic partnership with Washington focused on maritime security and tech. And we have this foundational historical military supply and energy relationship with Moscow that's already complex. But here's the part of the story that truly illustrates the paradox we started with: the bending bamboo in unexpected directions. Our sources pointed to some highly surprising, arguably contradictory military activity involving Beijing itself in mid-2025.
Yes, this is the moment where I think analysts across Asia and in Washington really paused and rewound the tape, asking, wait, what just happened? In July 2025, Vietnamese and Chinese ground forces conducted their first ever joint army exercise together.
First ever, with China.
First ever joint army exercise. This wasn't a naval exercise focused on, say, search and rescue, which might be easier to explain away diplomatically. This was a ground forces drill held in China's Guangxi region, which borders Vietnam. And it specifically focused on things like joint border patrols and sharing border management experience.
Wait, hold on. Let me get this straight. A country, Vietnam, that just cemented its highest possible diplomatic partnership with the United States, largely seen as a move to counter China, and which is locked in these deep-seated historical conflicts and very current, very real maritime disputes with China in the South China Sea,
Right.
suddenly turns around and participates in a first-ever joint army drill with Beijing's ground forces. That doesn't just stretch the tightrope. That seems like a direct tactical contradiction of the spirit, if not the letter, of the CSP signed just months earlier. How do you square that circle?
It is the clearest possible illustration of bamboo diplomacy in action. It demonstrates that flexibility and that profound ambiguity simultaneously. It's not a contradiction if you view it through Hanoi's lens of maximizing strategic independence. In fact, it is the calculated, logical result of what international relations scholars sometimes refer to as the strategic equilibrium paradox.
Okay, the strategic equilibrium paradox. Let's unpack that for the listener. What is the fundamental mechanism? What's the logic at play here?
Okay, the basic rule or the core idea of the strategic equilibrium paradox is this. When a major power, let's use the U.S. in this case, pushes a smaller power, Vietnam, too hard or too overtly, or tries to lock it too exclusively into joining its side against a major rival, like China.
Right, applying too much pressure to choose.
Exactly. When that pressure becomes too intense, the smaller power starts to feel its own strategic autonomy, its independence of action is being jeopardized. It risks losing control of its own foreign policy, becoming just an instrument for the great power.
So to rebalance things.
To rebalance, to push back against that pressure and reassert its independence, the smaller power will often immediately signal closeness, or at least continued engagement, with the rival power. In this case, conducting a highly visible, unprecedented joint military drill with China sends that signal loud and clear.
So the harder Washington pushes Hanoi to be, effectively, a dedicated security counterweight against Beijing.
The more likely Hanoi is to take visible, calculated steps like this joint drill to show both Beijing and Washington that it is not and will never be an exclusive ally of the U.S. It's a reassertion of neutrality, or maybe non-exclusivity.
Isn't the U.S. then being a bit politically naive to pressure Hanoi so openly if this dynamic is known? Don't they understand this paradox?
Well, that is the core challenge, the tightrope walk, for U.S. policymakers too, isn't it? They need Vietnam as a partner, but they have to understand the limits. They need to grasp that Vietnam's ultimate goal is not necessarily to help the U.S. defeat China. Vietnam's goal is to manage China, often using the U.S. relationship as leverage to do so, while preserving its own independence.
Okay, so the joint drill wasn't about suddenly becoming friends with China's army. It was about sending messages.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It serves multiple strategic messages simultaneously. To Beijing, the message is something like, look, despite our maritime disagreements, we still value stable borders, we can cooperate on mutual security issues like border management, and we are not inherently or permanently anti-China.
Reassurance for Beijing.
A degree of reassurance, yes. And to Washington, the message is just as clear, maybe even clearer. We retain our sovereign strategic room to maneuver. We will not be pressured into exclusivity. We will protect our independence by balancing these external pressures. It's the most sophisticated form of strategic sense-sitting you can imagine, designed specifically to prevent either superpower from taking Vietnam completely for granted.
So it keeps the equilibrium, maintains the balance.
That's the goal, to maintain that delicate strategic equilibrium where Vietnam holds the maximum possible independent leverage.
That is truly a masterful display of managing competing, intense geopolitical risks. But the military and diplomatic maneuvering doesn't just stop with the two superpowers, the U.S. and China and Russia, as the arms supplier. Vietnam is also leveraging its unique position, its unique history and political system, to play a potentially very useful role in high-stakes international diplomacy concerning, well, a third communist state, North Korea.
That's right. And this aspect really showcases Vietnam's potential value as a genuinely non-aligned actor, someone who can traverse different geopolitical blocks and maybe talk to actors that others can't easily engage with. We saw a very significant example of this in October 2025.
What happened then?
We saw a high-profile visit by Vietnam's General Secretary, To Lam, the top leader, to Pyongyang. He was there to attend the 80th anniversary celebrations of the founding of the Workers' Party of Korea, a big symbolic event in North Korea.
Okay, a high-level visit. But why is Vietnam, of all countries, seen as potentially having a unique diplomatic role with Pyongyang? What makes them qualified?
Well, Vietnam possesses this highly unusual, almost unique status in the current international system. First, it is a one-party communist state, just like North Korea. That provides immediate ideological common ground, a shared political language perhaps that few other countries have.
Okay, shared political system.
But second, and crucially, unlike North Korea, Vietnam has successfully navigated the post-Cold War world. It has managed to normalize and even upgrade its relations significantly with its former primary enemy, the United States. And it also have very strong positive relations with the highly prosperous democratic South Korea, a key U.S. ally.
So they've managed to bridge that divide themselves.
They have. They've shown it's possible to maintain their political system while engaging economically and diplomatically with the West and its allies. This gives them unparalleled credibility, potentially, as a kind of bridge or a model.
So they're positioning themselves almost as an example, a model for economic reform and maybe eventual political normalization without regime change.
Exactly. Look, North Korea remains highly isolated internationally, despite its recently growing ties with Russia and perhaps China. By expanding its own diplomatic relations with a respected, successful ASEAN member country like Vietnam, one that shares its political roots, but has found a different path. Pyongyang might be hoping to chip away at that isolation.
And maybe learn some lessons.
Perhaps learn some lessons about how economic opening might be possible without triggering immediate political liberalization or collapse. Vietnam, in turn, skillfully leverages this unique connection to play a constructive facilitating role in international affairs. It boosts their diplomatic profile.
How so?
They are arguably well-positioned, better than most, to act as a potential bridge, a facilitator for dialogue between North Korea and the outside world, including potentially the U.S. and South Korea, maybe Japan. It showcases their value as an independent, non-aligned actor with connections stretching across all the critical geopolitical blocs in East Asia.
So it effectively elevates their diplomatic importance far beyond just Southeast Asia. It makes them potentially an essential communicator, a go-between in the broader East Asian security architecture, dealing with one of the toughest issues.
That seems to be part of the calculation, yes. It enhances their overall strategic value proposition to everyone involved.
Yeah.
Hashtag outro. So when you pull all these different threads together, you've got the 1,000 years of history driving deep caution against China. You have the absolute economic imperative driving dependency on U.S. and Western markets and technology. You have the strict but deliberately flexible four-nose policy providing the framework. Then you layer on the high-tier comprehensive strategic partnership with Washington, focusing on security cooperation. Alongside that, the essential ongoing Russian arms dependency for military modernization. Then, that surprising equilibrium-seeking joint exercise with China, driven by the strategic equilibrium paradox. And finally, this unique bridge-building role they're carving out with North Korea.
A lot of moving parts.
It really is. But all of Vietnam's actions, all these seemingly complex and sometimes contradictory moves, they all point back to one singular, relentless, unifying objective: the pursuit and maintenance of strategic autonomy.
It really does feel like a strategy that moves far beyond just basic survival in a bipolar or maybe increasingly multipolar world where smaller nations are often just expected to pick a side, join a camp.
Absolutely. It's about optimization, not just survival. Vietnam isn't just trying to stay afloat between the giants. It seems they are actively, consciously playing the competing superpowers off against each other to maximize their own advantage.
How so? What are they extracting?
They seem to be strategically extracting concessions and benefits from both sides. They get technology access, security assurances, crucial market access, and political validation from the West, particularly the U.S.
And from China and Russia.
Balanced with capital for infrastructure, investment, relative stability on their northern border from China, and those essential advanced weapon systems from Russia, they're trying to get the best of all possible worlds, leveraging the competition for their own national development goals.
So the effectiveness, the sophistication, the sheer agility of this bamboo diplomacy, it all really hinges at the end of the day on Vietnam's continued economic success, doesn't it?
Entirely. That economic dynamism, that growth, is what provides the tangible leverage, the national confidence, and the international standing necessary to sustain this incredibly complex, demanding, and, so far at least, remarkably effective balancing act on the world stage. Without the economic foundation, the bamboo might not be strong enough to bend without breaking.